Hello everybody, and welcome back to Nick's Listening Space. Today, we're going to talk about the Arylic LP20. It costs just $200, and I think on the surface, it's just another affordable music streamer. But after living with this guy for the last several weeks, I have to say that I think it's a little bit more than just a streamer. It can sit at the center of someone's first serious hi-fi system. Eventually, it can kind of disappear into a much larger system of separates. I want to answer three things with this review. And the first one is, how good is the LP20 as the center of an affordable system? Two, how close does the LP20 get to my 2021 Bluesound Node that I've had in my reference system now for some time? The third question I want to answer is, and what happens when you do something that feels almost sacrilegious and run vinyl through the LP20's analog to digital converter? Now, this last one really surprised me, and I want to talk about that, but first let's get into build quality. The LP20 is plastic, thin, and a little hollow. It doesn't feel premium, although at $200, I'm not so sure that this guy needs to. My bigger complaint is the included USB power supply brick that it comes with. I have to say that it feels rather cheap. I think that the cable that it comes with is rather flimsy. And considering that the LP20 can kind of exist as your entire digital front end hub, I think this is one area worth revisiting later. Because I do think that replacing the default power brick that it comes with something much better can give you a sizable performance boost. Fortunately, the physical construction isn't the full story here. So turn the LP20 around and things become much more interesting. You know, as far as inputs and outputs are concerned, you are going to get Ethernet. You're also going to get USB that you can connect an external storage or a hard drive to. You also have a 12-volt trigger. This guy also has a USB-C power delivery, which I'll talk more about, but you can additionally connect this to a computer and use it as a DAC. You're also going to get coax and optical digital outputs. You're also going to get an RCA analog output, which basically when we use that, we're using the internal DAC. We're also going to get optical input and line level RCA input. We also get a subwoofer output here, but I won't really comment on that because I don't have a subwoofer currently hooked up. But for $200, there's an impressive amount of connectivity here. One connection that I think deserves special attention, and I want to talk more about this in this review, but that is the analog input. So the analog input does not offer a pure analog bypass. So essentially that means that everything entering through its RCA input is going to first be converted to a digital signal. From there, you can either use the LP20's internal DAC or you can send that digital signal to an external DAC. So I want to come back to that, but first I want to talk about kind of utilizing the LP20 as a system hub. I think a lot of people today are kind of building a streaming first system or a streaming only system, and I think that that is where the LP20 makes a lot of sense. But you could connect it directly to a power amplifier and a pair of passive speakers, or you could connect the LP20 directly to a pair of powered speakers, and you have this simple kind of compact streaming system. You know, now you have a streamer, volume control, multiple inputs, a DAC, remote, and as well as some small EQ, all kind of compacted into one box. When we pair the LP20 with a decent pair of powered speakers, you could essentially build your very first capable system that is not going to be that much more than, you know, probably that Bluetooth speaker you were thinking about purchasing. And, you know, kind of unlike a Bluetooth speaker, you have somewhere to kind of grow. And I think that's one of the important distinctions here is that with the LP20, you can kind of almost do everything out of the box with this one device and then slowly take responsibilities away from the LP20 as your system grows. Now for most of this review, I used the LP20 connected via Ethernet, then connected to my Topping D50 III via coax. But I also connected my television through its optical cable. I also had my Rega Planar 3 connected to my Rega Mk5 moving magnet phono preamp, then connected to its onboard input. This gave me kind of one small box managing nearly every source that I currently use. And that is really where I begin to understand the LP20, because it isn't really just a streamer. It's kind of a digital traffic controller. Growing the LP20 into separates here, I think the first obvious upgrade is an external DAC, because you can use the LP20's internal converter just fine. But I do think that if we want to see a sizable upgrade here, going with an aftermarket or an external DAC is going to be the best combo. From here, you could add a dedicated preamplifier. I use the LP20 with my Freya Plus as well as my Fozzy Audio GR70. And the GR70 is interesting here because it only has one analog input, one analog output. And normally that would be limiting. But the LP20 can gather all of our digital and analog sources together before then sending those into a single input. So the LP20 kind of handles our source selection and streaming almost as like a preamp. And then the GR70 we can add for kind of gain, tube character, and headphone functionality. For amplification, I primarily use the SMSL PA40, which is an amplifier that I'm currently working on another review for, so stay tuned, and as well as my line magnetic LM34IA. I also tried the LP20 with the SMSL AO300 integrated amplifier that I recently reviewed. Now, the AO300 already kind of includes HDMI ARC and its own DAC, so there is some overlap there, but it does create a very capable two-box solution. And this is the larger point, is that the LP20 can live comfortably in a very inexpensive setup, but it can also survive several rounds of upgrades before you actually feel like you need to replace it. But now we get to the part that I think surprised me the most, and that's its onboard analog input. So as I've already said, anything entering the LP20 through its RCA input is going to first be digitized. So my vinyl signal path looks something like this, but essentially you have your turntable, then that signal is fed into your phono preamplifier. From there, we're feeding the signal into our LP20 as an analog signal. From there, it's going to be digitized, and then either from there, we can send it out its RCA input back out as an analog signal after it's been converted, or we can use an external DAC. And at least on paper, this feels incredibly wrong. And I think that part of the appeal of vinyl is this idea that the signal remains analog, from the cartridge all the way through the system. So why would I intentionally want to digitize the analog signal, right? Well, the LP20 is not a unique device here, because the WIM streamers also do this as well, and there are many others. There is also a product called the Parks Audio Waxwing, which, if you don't know, they have an entire philosophy around bringing vinyl into the digital domain. So once the signal is digital, you can perform extremely precise processing, equalization, channel correction, and even noise reduction. At least that's the idea. So the LP20 does not really offer that level of vinyl-specific processing, but it gives me a chance to experience and play around with the basic concept. So I was very surprised really by how much I like this whole conversion thing. I think I still have a lot more to kind of play around with it before I kind of put a definitive stamp of approval on it. But for example, listening to my Columbia reissue of Miles Davis, Kind of Blue, the presentation still had that tonal richness and kind of natural texture that I would associate with vinyl. One thing that's different here is the leading edges sound cleaner. transients feel more defined. I would say imaging here is a little more organized as well as the background being much quieter, or maybe you want to say darker. The LP20 didn't erase the character of the turntable or the phono stage, it just presented that same character a little bit differently. I think that the best description I wrote in my notes was, it just sounds like somebody took a squeegee to the music. I think the warmth is still there, the texture is still there, but there is less haze around it. Because both the title and the turntable eventually pass through the same topping DAC, I could compare the digital and the vinyl version of the same album through the same final conversion stage. And they did not suddenly sound identical. I think the vinyl still, again, has its own tonal density and flavor. But the digitized vinyl gains a level of clarity and precision that I was not expecting. I don't fully understand why this is, right? Now I'm not an engineer, so I don't want to overstate kind of this technical explanation, but as far as I know, once the signal is digitized, everything after the analog to digital conversion remains digital until the final DAC. That removes several analog stages where noise, grounding issue, or interference could potentially creep in. Now, whatever the exact reason is, in my system, the result was cleaner leading edges, tighter bass, better image definition, as well as a quieter background. And I still felt like I was listening to vinyl. You might want to know, like, is it universally better? I mean, I would say no. I don't quite have enough experience with this whole conversion process to really put a pin in it, but I no longer think that it is inherently worse either. I just think that it's different. I think it certainly opens my mind to a signal path that I probably would have dismissed before trying this out. So it's something that I look forward to trying more in the future. And like, I'm very curious about the Waxwing phono preamp. How does this guy stack up to my Bluesound Node is kind of the next question I want to answer here. Well, after several weeks with the LP20, I kept coming back to the same question. And how does it compare to my 2021 Bluesound Node? I've used the Node for the last 5 or so years now, and I know the software, I know the sound, and overall I've been very happy with the Bluesound Node. Having said that, I'm very curious about what else is on the market, just because that's the nature of who I am, but overall I've been very happy with it. So comparing both of these devices, at least when we use them as streamer / DAC combos, I think that the Node is still the better performer. At least to my ears, the Node is a fuller, smoother, kind of more confident sounding streamer. But the LP20 is a little leaner and a little less refined. But things become much more interesting when you start using both as transports. So when we connect the LP20 to a dedicated DAC like a Topping D50 or greater, those differences between these two streamers begins to narrow almost immediately. I think that when we do this, the LP20 begins punching considerably above its price point. Then I change the power supply. So I've talked about this and I want to dive in depth here, but the LP20 requires a 5-volt 2-amp circuit. So I replaced the stock USB adapter with the Duke Audio D2 linear power supply, and almost immediately the presentation opens up. The images became much more focused, separation improved, and the LP20 sounded smoother and fuller. I think with the stock supply it could sound slightly soft and maybe even a little woolly. But again, when we add that Duke in there, it felt like this veil had been lifted. So I'm not saying everybody here probably needs to go out and spend another $80 on a linear power supply, but I genuinely dislike the included brick to the point that I'm willing to do that. I think at a minimum, I would use a reputable USB supply you already own, even if it's something that you came with your cell phone. I think for somebody building a more serious system around the LP20, however, the Duke makes a worthwhile improvement in my setup. Once I combine the external DAC and the upgraded power supply, I think again the gap between the LP20 and the Node becomes much smaller than I expected. And this is probably the biggest compliment that I can give the LP20 now, because Node hasn't suddenly become a bad streamer. The Node is a very good streamer. Having now reviewed the LP20, I think this is a reminder of how quickly digital audio is moving. 5 years ago, the Node was one of the obvious choices in its price range. I still think that the Node is a great choice, but we just have more choices today. Today, a $200 product under the right conditions is getting pretty damn close. And this is kind of a lesson that we have to understand when we're buying things. I'm very hesitant to spend huge amounts of money on a streamer right now. I'm fairly confident that your $300 or $500 or even $1,000 streamer today is going to be beaten in the next 3 to 5 years. That is just the rate of how fast the digital market is moving. I think that digital streaming is still kind of a growing thing. I think more and more people are going to continue streaming. I think more people that use Spotify are going to start to upgrade to Tidal and better streaming platforms. So the way I see it is that kind of the perfect streamer, or the state of streamers right now, is still very amorphous and in this kind of product development phase. I think the fact that we're seeing such massive improvements in streaming and streamers makes me very hesitant to spend huge amounts of money on a streamer right now. I think part of that is, again, it's just the market is moving far too quickly. If I were putting together a system today and I had a budget, I think I would rather spend more of that budget on speakers, amplifiers, or room treatment. That's just kind of my thought processes on this, and it's one of the reasons why I think the LP20 could be a really great starter streamer, or a really good jump off point for somebody's very first HiFi system. I want to talk about software now, but I think this is where the Node still kind of earns its higher price point, because the LP20 uses Arylic's Go Control app. It works, but it feels kind of basic, and you can select inputs, you can control the volume, you have some minor EQ adjustments. Of course, you can access your streaming services through the app, you can use Bluetooth, as well as play music through a USB storage device. And for most of my listening, I think I barely used it. I primarily controlled the LP20 through Tidal Connect and Spotify Connect. I think most of the time that worked well, but I did experience the occasional connection problem. A few times the LP20 would disappear from my Go Control app while still remaining visible inside the Tidal app. So it was like I couldn't change inputs with the app, but I could still stream music to it. Other times it disappeared from my Tidal app as well and then remained in the Go Control app. Sometimes it would simply reappear later without any obvious explanation. I would like to see Arylic continue refining the software, because I think the hardware deserves it. And I think that if Arylic continues to develop better and better streamers, that critique of their software is going to become more of a talking point. That said, guys, I've owned the Bluesound Node long enough to know that even this mature streaming platform and software called BlueOS can still misbehave. It still has connection issues occasionally, right? Streaming is incredibly convenient. It can also be incredibly frustrating. I think that with a turntable, when something stops working, the problem is usually physically right in front of you. But with streaming, the problem could be the app, the router, the operating system, a software update. there are issues that are kind of invisible to the streaming world that, if we're honest with ourselves, these things, they occur, and they're frustrating events, right? You want to sit down and play music, and now I have to go reset my router and dick around plugging cables in and out, reset my streamer, turn everything on and off. And then I'm playing around with this for the next half hour when all I wanted to do was come home and put on a song, right? So I don't think the LP20 is really far off from any of the issues I've experienced with the Bluesound Node. I would say they're both on par. It's streaming after all. You're going to have some occasional connection issues. But overall, I've been really happy with the LP20's like connectivity and usability. You know, and with that, I would strongly recommend you connect the LP20 through your Ethernet cable, dual wired connection. I've never really had great experience with streaming music over Wi-Fi. You may have a different setup or a different router or whatever that may work out differently for you, but that's just my kind of experiences. So that's my recommendation. You know, lastly, I want to talk about some limitations here. I think there are a few compromises with the LP20 that are worth mentioning. The LP20 does not offer the same native Roon support as the Bluesound Node. So if you are heavily invested in Roon, or that's something you're thinking about, you know, doing or going down that route, I still think the Bluesound Node might be a better option for you. It also does not include HDMI ARC. And while you can connect your television through optical, and it works, you are not going to get the same level of remote control integration and some of these other things that you get with HDMI ARC. So I think if your stereo doubles as a television system, again, you may want to consider getting something with HDMI ARC, you know, or you just figure out a way to integrate HDMI ARC elsewhere in the chain through a DAC or an integrated amplifier. And one of the quick workarounds with this for me was I used the SMSL AO300 integrated amplifier, and that particular integrated amplifier has HDMI ARC. So that's a real simple kind of, again, two-box solution that could include HDMI ARC. I would say as far as like setup goes, there was some initial weird things where it wanted you to use your router's 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi network. I don't know if that would be a problem with every Wi-Fi router because I'm not 100% on that, but some routers might not have a 2.4 gigahertz bandwidth setup. I could be wrong though, so I don't know. But you know, once that was set up, everything behaved normally, but it was just a kind of a weird initial setup process with the LP20. You know, one of the things is when you switch from your network stream input to, say, the RCA input on the LP20, your stream will completely stop. So if you wanted to go back to the stream, you're going to find that no song will be playing, and you'll have to go through and select which song you want to play. So that's something, you know, none of these were really deal breakers for me, but I just wanted to mention that because it might be for somebody else. So what do I think of the Arylic LP20? Well, I came away from this review far more impressed than I expected. While the enclosure feels a little cheap and the included power supply could sure use some working on, and the software maybe is not fully baked and matured yet, I think that comparing this to my Bluesound Node, the LP20 does something the Node never really encouraged me to do. The LP20 invites me to experiment. Again, you know, you can start with this one little streaming device and it can do almost everything. It starts off as a streamer and a DAC and a preamp, and then over time, you know, you can upgrade and strip away some of those responsibilities. And I think that that makes this guy such an appealing first-time device. I wish that the marketing and the awareness around these kinds of devices was positioned a little bit better in the marketplace. You know, it's similar to the WIM, so maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the marketing for kind of these all-in-one devices is already there. For me, when I looked at the LP20 and I look at I look at the listing page for it, and you look at the information, it doesn't initially scream like I'm an all-in-one digital hub. I think it's only when you get it home and you start questioning, like, well, what do these inputs do? What do these outputs do? How can I hook this up? Do you really start to see the full potential? And perhaps that's why we need to have reviews of any of this gear in the first place. So that is for sure one of the things that I want to discuss with this review. You know, the ADC experiment also really surprised me here, because I really expected digitizing vinyl to remove something that I valued. And instead it preserved most of the character I love about vinyl while changing the presentation in a way that I genuinely enjoyed. You know, when we do this digitization, in my experience, it was cleaner, it was quieter, it was more organized. I mean, is it necessarily better? It's hard. I think it's just different. I think the Bluesound Node kind of remains, it's just different. The Bluesound Node remains more of a polished product in the end. I think the Blue OS software is better, more mature. I think Rune support matters for many people, and in that sense, it makes a lot of sense. Again, HDMI ARC is a kind of modern day feature that I'm always harking on about. If you've got loved ones that are trying to operate your system, having the volume tied to your TV remote is like the simplest, most foolproof way to let somebody else use it. I think if you were possibly only looking to purchase a streamer and really take advantage of that full streamer and its internal DAC and everything else, perhaps the Node is still the better option. But the LP20 costs roughly 1/3 what I originally paid for the Bluesound Node. And of course, once we add an external DAC, a better power delivery system, that sonic gap between these two streamers is surprisingly small or possibly non-existent. I mean, really, that's the difference is almost negligible at this point. And at the end of the day, this tells me something about where affordable streaming is today. You may not need to spend a fortune on a streamer itself. You may not want to spend a fortune on a streamer itself. The bigger differences may come down to software, connectivity, power delivery, and how that device lives in your system and how you use it. Would I recommend the LP20? Absolutely. I think especially for somebody putting together their very first system, I think it's a great place. You start simple, it can do almost everything, and then over time, if you wanted to upgrade, you could. I think when everything else has changed, you may discover that that little $200 box is sitting there doing the one job you actually bought it for, streaming music. For $200, I think the Arylic LP20 is one of the strongest values I've encountered in affordable streaming or affordable hi-fi. Thank you guys for watching this review. If you enjoyed this review, consider subscribing to the channel. I'm really curious about what your thoughts are in terms of this kind of all-in-one streaming box. If you're somebody today, okay, who's streaming music, or maybe you want to listen to CDs, but it's still all in the digital domain, the question is, if all you want to do is stream music, why do we need all these other boxes, right? Why do we need to have a preamplifier with 10 inputs? Why do we need to have a big beefy power amp? And right, so the idea is that if you could have a preamplifier hub device that basically is your streamer, hell, even if it had a phono preamp already built into it, right? I mean, it almost becomes your integrated amplifier without the amp stage. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but essentially, guys, I see the evolution of hi-fi kind of happening real time, in which kind of this idea of a dedicated preamp, a dedicated power amp, a dedicated streamer, a dedicated DAC, maybe some of that is stupid, right? I guess the idea is that could you just go buy, you know, the endgame LP20? So The LP20 is a starter device, but if you could purchase your $10,000 LP20 all in one box that was your preamplifier, it took all your inputs and everything, and then all you needed after that one box was a power amplifier and a pair of speakers, and then as a bonus you could also hook up your turntable to it. I don't know, you know, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to explain in my mind, but if we're taking greater priority over the digital domain, what does that really mean for analog? And how long do we keep something digital before we convert it to analog, right? And vice versa. Anyways, guys, if you have any comments, please, I'd love to hear from you down below. I really apologize. It's been quite some time since I've made a video, but I've been very busy and had a lot of things going on in my personal life that kind of has prevented me from making some videos. But I'm kind of falling behind on some videos, so I'm going to try to get some videos out in the next couple weeks to try to catch up to kind of my reviews, because I do have a lot that I need to get done. And yeah, guys, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Have a great day. Bye-bye. Hello, everybody. All right, let's fucking do this, guys. Hello. So, as far as inputs and outputs are concerned, for for most of this, now we get to the part that really surprised me the most with the LP20, and that is its onboard analog input. So as I've already stated, so